Every year on the same night, at the same table, the city of Port Meridian held its breath for one man, and every year, without fail, the doors of Ombra opened for him before he even touched the handle. Tonight, they didn't open. Tonight, a maître d' with trembling hands looked Dimitri Kane in the eye and told him the restaurant was full. Tonight, for the first time in 11 years, the most dangerous man on the waterfront stood outside in the cold on his own birthday, and nobody inside knew that the woman who would save his life was standing 40 feet away in a stained apron wiping down a fryer basket, completely unaware that the next 90 seconds would change both of their lives forever. Before we go any further into this story, if you're the kind of person who loves dark tales of power, obsession, betrayal, and the kind of twist you don't see coming until it's already happened, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the Mafia Boss stories. And once you've heard what Naomi Reyes did that night, I want you in the comments telling me honestly, would you have had the nerve to do the same thing? Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the man everyone in Port Meridian feared, and the woman nobody bothered to notice. Dimitri Kane was 38 years old, and in 11 of those years, he had built something out of the bones of a dying shipping district that no one, not the unions, not the old families, not the police who took his money and pretended not to, had the courage to challenge. He controlled the docks. He controlled what came in and what went out. And more importantly, he controlled who got to eat, sleep, and breathe easy in the 6 blocks around the harbor. Men who crossed him disappeared quietly. Men who served him well grew rich slowly, which was its own kind of mercy, because Dimitri Kane did not believe in rewarding people too quickly. Fast money made men sloppy. He preferred loyalty that had time to calcify into something permanent. He was not a large man in the way people expected. He didn't need to be. He had a stillness that did more work than muscle ever could, a way of letting silence stretch in a room until the person across from him started talking just to fill it, said things they hadn't meant to say, gave up information they'd sworn they'd take to the grave. His tailoring was deliberately understated, dark wool with no ornamentation, no rings, no watch that announced its own price. The only thing he ever wore that meant anything was a plain steel lighter, dented on one corner, that had belonged to his father, and he carried it not out of sentiment, but because he liked having something in his pocket that was older than his own reputation. Every year on his birthday, Dimitri Kane ate alone at the same corner table at Ombra, the restaurant his father used to take him to as a boy, back when Ombra was a modest place with sawdust on the floor and nothing to prove. It had changed hands twice since then, been polished and repriced for a wealthier clientele, but the tradition had never changed. He arrived at 9. He was seated at his table. The staff who had learned this ritual over the years knew to leave a particular kind of quiet around him. Not fear exactly, more like the careful quiet you keep around something that could go off. This year, Ombra had changed hands again. A new owner, a new investor group, and standing at the door on the night of Dimitri Kane's 38th birthday was a maitre d' named Victor Calloway, a man who had been hired 8 weeks earlier and who did not know, or claimed not to know, what walking through that door on this particular night meant to the man standing in front of him. "I'm sorry, sir," Victor said, not quite meeting Dimitri's eyes. "We're fully booked tonight. No exceptions." For a long moment, Dimitri said nothing at all. That was the part that should have frightened Victor more than anything. The silence, not the words. Dimitri looked past him into the warmly lit dining room, half the tables visibly empty, waitstaff drifting between them with the loose, unhurried motion of a slow night, and he understood, with the particular clarity that had kept him alive for 11 years, that he was being lied to on purpose. "Say that again," Dimitri said quietly. Victor's throat worked. "The reservation system, we've had some changes, sir. I wasn't told about any standing arrangement." "You weren't told," Dimitri repeated, and something in his voice made the hostess 2 feet away suddenly find something urgent to do with the menus in her hands. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was the thing people who didn't know him always got wrong when they imagined what a man like Dimitri Kane would sound like when he was angry. He simply looked at Victor Calloway the way a man looks at a door he is deciding whether to break down, and then he turned, and he walked back out onto the sidewalk, into the cold, and stood there beneath the awning with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw set like something carved. What Dimitri didn't know, what nobody standing at that door knew, was that Victor Calloway owed $41,000 to a man named Salvo Marchetti, and that 3 days earlier, Salvo had sat across from him in a booth at a diner 2 neighborhoods over and explained very calmly exactly what would happen to Victor's sister in Ohio if Dimitri Kane was not standing outside alone, exposed beneath that awning at exactly 9:15 on the night of his birthday. Port Meridian was a city built on things that arrived by water and left by truck, and for as long as anyone could remember, the men who controlled that rhythm had controlled everything else worth having. The warehouses, the contracts, the quiet arrangements with officials who needed their palms greased and their consciences left alone. Dimitri's father had run a smaller version of that same operation, rougher, hungrier, and had died for it in a way Dimitri had never fully discussed with anyone, not even Sergio. What Dimitri had built afterward was deliberately different, colder, more careful, built on patience instead of violence, wherever patience would do the job just as well. It was that patience, more than any gun in his organization, that had kept him alive as long as he had. And it was that same patience that made him dangerous in a way most of his rivals never fully understood until it was too late to matter. Salvo Marchetti had wanted the docks for 6 years. He had tried buying his way in, tried marrying his way in through a cousin, tried 3 separate attempts on Dimitri's life that had all ended with Salvo's men in the harbor instead of Dimitri in the ground. This time, Salvo had learned patience. This time, there would be no crew, no van, no chaos that could be traced. This time, there would be a man on the rooftop of the parking structure across the street with a rifle he'd been practicing with for 2 months, and all he needed was 90 seconds of Dimitri Kane standing still in a predictable place at a predictable time, which was the one thing about Dimitri that had never changed in 11 years. Inside Ombra's kitchen, none of this had reached the ears of a 29-year-old line cook named Naomi Reyes, who was scraping down a fryer basket and thinking, as she often did during the last hour of a shift, about whether she'd get home in time to read her daughter a bedtime story before Lily fell asleep on her own again. Naomi had been at Ombra for 4 months. She kept her head down, worked her station, took the extra shifts nobody else wanted, and said almost nothing to anyone, which was exactly how she liked it. Nobody at Ombra knew that 6 years earlier, Naomi Reyes had been a combat medic attached to a forward unit overseas, that she had pulled 2 men out of a burning vehicle under fire, that she had learned to read a room for exits and threats the way other people read a menu. Nobody knew, because after she came home and her marriage fell apart and she found herself raising Lily alone on a cook's wage, she had folded that whole version of herself away like a uniform she wasn't allowed to wear anymore. It didn't pay the bills. It didn't matter here. She might never have looked up from the fryer basket at all if it hadn't been for the sound. Not loud, nothing crashed, nothing broke, just the particular hush that fell over a room when everyone in it decided at once not to look at something. She glanced through the pass-through window into the dining room and saw Victor Calloway's face, pale and sweating despite the restaurant's cool air conditioning, and she saw the direction he kept glancing, toward the front door, toward the street, every 11 or 12 seconds, like a man checking a clock only he could see. Naomi had spent enough time around men who were afraid of something specific to know the difference between a man who was simply nervous and a man who was counting down. She set down the fryer basket. She walked to the window at the end of the kitchen, the one that looked out over the side alley toward the parking structure across the street, and she looked up, out of nothing more than the old unkillable habit of checking rooftops, and she saw a shape up there that didn't belong. Too still, too deliberate, a silhouette that had the patient geometry of a man lying prone behind something. Everything after that happened in under 2 minutes, though it would replay in Naomi's memory for months afterward at a fraction of that speed. She didn't scream. Screaming would have done nothing except tell the man on the roof that he'd been spotted before he was ready, and screaming would have frozen the man standing under the awning in exactly the wrong place for exactly the wrong amount of time. Instead, Naomi Reyes ripped off her apron, shoved through the kitchen side door into the alley, and ran. Dimitri heard footsteps before he saw her. Quick, controlled, not the panicked clatter of someone running from something, but the purposeful stride of someone running toward something, which was, in his experience, far more alarming. He turned in time to see a woman in a kitchen uniform closing the distance between them at a dead sprint, and his hand had already moved half an inch toward the weapon at his hip before she said the only 4 words that could have stopped him from reacting the way 11 years of instinct told him to react. "Rooftop now, move." He didn't ask questions. Later, he would wonder why he hadn't, why some part of him had simply trusted the certainty in a stranger's voice over his own trained caution. But in that instant, there wasn't room for wondering. Naomi grabbed the front of his coat with both hands and drove her shoulder into his chest, and the two of them went down together behind the low concrete planter beside Ombra's entrance, just as the first shot cracked across the street and took a chunk out of the brick exactly where Dimitri's head had been a half-second earlier. The second shot hit the planter. The third went wide into the awning canvas above them. By the fourth, Dimitri had rolled, pulled his own weapon, and put 2 rounds up toward the rooftop with the flat, economical motion of a man who had done this before and hoped never to have to explain it to the woman currently pinned beneath him behind 18 inches of concrete. Sirens, somewhere in the distance, still minutes away. On the rooftop across the street, the shape retreated, scrambling back from the ledge, because a shooter who has lost the element of surprise and is now being shot back at is a shooter with a very different set of priorities than the one he had 90 seconds earlier. Within another 30 seconds, he was gone, down the far stairwell, into a car that had been idling 2 blocks away for exactly this contingency, and Salvo Marchetti's third attempt on Dimitri Kane's life had failed, though nobody standing on that sidewalk knew that yet. What Dimitri knew in the ringing silence after the last shot was that he was alive, and that the reason he was alive was currently lying half beneath him on a cold sidewalk with a scraped elbow and steady, unhurried breathing, actually checking, with 2 fingers pressed briefly to the side of his throat, whether he'd been hit. "You're not shot," she said, more to herself than to him, confirming it the way a medic confirms things, out loud. So the information becomes real. Then, as if noticing for the first time whose chest she was still half lying across, she pulled back, sat up against the planter, and looked at him properly for the first time, not with fear, which was the reaction he was used to, and not with the calculating fascination of the women who usually found their way into his orbit, but with the plain, assessing look of someone who had just finished a job and was checking the results. "Who are you?" Dimitri said. It wasn't really a question. It came out low, almost private, the way a man speaks when the adrenaline is still working its way out of his blood and the words haven't caught up to whatever it was he actually meant to ask, which was closer to "how did you know?" and "why did you move like that?" and "who taught you to run toward gunfire instead of away from it?" "Naomi," she said. "I work the fry station." As if that explained anything, as if a line cook simply happened to know how to identify a sniper's silhouette on a rooftop at 40 feet in the dark, happened to know how to tackle a 200-pound man out of a kill zone without breaking either of their necks, happened to check a pulse with the calm efficiency of someone who had checked 100 pulses before under circumstances far worse than this one. He was still looking at her, and something in his expression had shifted in a way that would have alarmed anyone who knew him well enough to read it. The careful stillness cracking, just slightly, around the edges, the way ice cracks before it gives way entirely, not because it's weak, but because something underneath it has finally pressed hard enough. The first police car turned onto the block, lights washing red and blue across the wet pavement, and Naomi Reyes, still catching her breath, still bleeding slightly from the scraped elbow, watched Dimitri Kane's face rearrange itself back into the composed, unreadable mask that every other person in Port Meridian had only ever seen him wear. It happened fast. It happened so smoothly that if she hadn't just spent 90 seconds seeing underneath it, she might have believed the mask was all there was. "Say nothing," he told her, quiet and precise, already rising, already extending a hand to pull her to her feet. To them, to anyone inside, you saw nothing. You did nothing. "I have a daughter at home," she said. Which was not an argument, exactly, but was the only thing that mattered enough in that moment to say out loud. "I'm not interested in being a witness to anything. I just didn't want to watch a man get his head taken off on a sidewalk." Something about the bluntness of it, the total absence of flattery, of fear, Of the careful calculation every other person in his life used when they spoke to him seemed to land somewhere in Dimitri that hadn't been touched by anything in a very long time. The days that followed were quiet on the surface, and anything but underneath. Dimitri did not go back to Umbra. He sent instead a man named Sergio Petrov, his second, the only person in the organization Dimitri trusted with information that could get someone killed, to find out everything there was to know about a line cook named Naomi Reyes. What came back surprised even Sergio, who had learned over the years not to be surprised by much. A widow, technically. Divorced, if you wanted to be precise about it, though her ex-husband had been out of the picture so thoroughly it amounted to the same thing. A 6-year-old daughter named Lily, a service record that had been sealed tighter than most, and took Sergio 3 days and one very expensive favor to even partially unlock. 2 commendations. 1 incident report, heavily redacted, involving a vehicle fire and 2 extractions under hostile fire that had earned her a decoration she had never once mentioned to a single person at Umbra. She's not just a cook, Sergio said, laying the folder on Dimitri's desk. She's the reason you're alive, and she's been sitting 40 feet away from you for 4 months, and you never noticed her. I noticed her, Dimitri said, which was true, though not in the way he meant it to sound, and Sergio, who had worked for this man for 9 years, wisely said nothing further. Dimitri went to her, not to the restaurant. He understood, with a discretion that surprised even him, that showing up at Naomi's workplace after what had happened would put a target on her that she hadn't asked for and didn't deserve. He went instead to the small apartment above a hardware store on the east side on a Tuesday evening and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment before he made himself knock, which was not a hesitation he was accustomed to feeling about anything. Naomi opened the door with a dish towel still in one hand and Lily's cartoon audible from somewhere behind her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "You shouldn't be here," she said finally, though she didn't close the door. "I know," he said. "I came anyway." What followed over the next several weeks was not the swift, sweeping seduction that men like Dimitri Kane were rumored to be capable of. It was slower than that, and stranger, because Naomi Reyes was not a woman who could be moved by money or by fear, having already proven she was immune to both. And Dimitri found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, having to actually earn something instead of simply taking it. He learned that she took her coffee black and her arguments straight, no cushioning, no softening for his ego. He learned that Lily liked to be read to in silly voices, and that Dimitri Kane, a man who had ordered the docks emptied with a single phone call, was catastrophically bad at doing a silly voice. A fact that made Naomi laugh for the first time in his presence. A real laugh, unguarded, and he understood in that moment that he would burn the entire city down before he let anything take that laugh away from her. He also learned, slowly, carefully, the way you learn something a person has kept locked away for a reason, why she had buried the medic so deep. It wasn't only the marriage, though that had been its own quiet catastrophe. It was the coming home from what she had seen and done overseas and finding a country that had no place, no gratitude, and no use for the specific competence she'd built had felt like a second kind of loss, one that never made the paperwork. She'd stopped telling people. It was easier to be underestimated than to explain herself to people who wouldn't understand anyway. And somewhere in that decision, she had also stopped fully trusting anyone to see the whole of her at once. Dimitri never asked her to prove herself again after that first night. He didn't need to, but the world around them had other plans because Salvo Marchetti, having failed once, was not a man who believed in stopping at once. It took another 6 weeks for Salvo's second attempt to take shape, and this time it was smarter, uglier, and aimed at the one place Dimitri Kane had never let anyone get close to before, which was exactly the point. Salvo had watched, through the network of eyes he still had left in Port Meridian, as Dimitri began appearing, quietly but unmistakably, in the company of a line cook and her daughter. He understood immediately what that meant. A man like Dimitri Kane, who had spent 11 years making sure he had nothing anyone could take from him, had finally handed the city a lever, and Salvo intended to use it. The plan was almost elegant in its cruelty. Victor Calloway, still drowning in debt, still terrified, was given one final task: find out Lily's school schedule. He balked. Even a desperate man has a line, until Salvo reminded him gently, patiently, exactly what desperation was for. Victor gave up the information within the hour, hating himself the entire time. Naomi noticed the black sedan outside Lily's school 3 days running before anyone else did, because noticing things like black sedans idling in places they shouldn't be was a reflex she had never fully let go of, no matter how deep she'd buried the rest of it. She didn't panic. She didn't call the police, understanding on some level that the police were not equipped for whatever this actually was. She called Dimitri, and for the first time since the night on the sidewalk, she heard something in his voice that she had not heard before. Not the cold control, not the velvet calm he wore like a second skin, but something closer to fear, raw and immediate for a person other than himself. "Get her out of the building," he said. "Now. Side entrance, not the front. I'm 4 minutes out." What happened at that school? The confrontation in the parking lot. The two of Salvo's men who had been sent not to kill, but to take, to establish the leverage they needed, and the 11 seconds in which Naomi Reyes, moving on instinct honed years earlier in far worse places, disarmed the first man before he'd even fully registered that a line cook in jeans and sneakers had just broken his wrist, while Dimitri, arriving at a dead run, put the second man down before he could reach for Lily at all, would become, in the retelling among the handful of people who ever learned the true version, the story that finally answered the question everyone in Port Meridian had been quietly asking since the night of Dimitri's birthday. Who exactly was this woman standing beside the most dangerous man in the city? She hadn't needed saving. That was the thing that broke something open in Dimitri Kane completely, watching her move. Precise, economical, terrifyingly calm, to put herself physically between a 6-year-old and 2 armed men before he'd even gotten out of the car. He had spent his entire adult life building walls specifically so that no one could ever again make him feel the particular helplessness of watching someone he couldn't protect get hurt. And in the space of 11 seconds, Naomi Reyes had rendered that entire architecture unnecessary because she had simply refused to need it. What followed was not slow this time. Sergio traced the 2 men back to Salvo within a day, and Victor Calloway, when Dimitri's men found him, confessed everything within the first 10 minutes, weeping, begging for his sister's safety. And Dimitri, in the one act of the entire story that surprised even Sergio, did not have him killed. He had him disappear instead, moved, sister and all, somewhere far outside Salvo's reach, on the condition that Victor testify, quietly and privately, to exactly what he knew. Because Dimitri Kane had learned, in the space of a few short months, that there was a difference between justice and cruelty, and that the man standing at Ombra's door that night had been a coward, not a killer, and cowards' debts could be repaid without blood. Salvo Marchetti's debt could not. The end, when it came, was not loud. Dimitri did not need it to be. 6 years of failed attempts on his life had earned Salvo exactly the kind of patient, methodical reckoning that Dimitri specialized in. The docks closed to him first, quietly, contract by contract, until every source of income Salvo had left dried up within a matter of weeks. The men who worked for him, sensing which way the tide was turning, began disappearing from his organization one by one. Not killed, simply gone, offered better terms elsewhere by a man who understood that loyalty bought slowly was loyalty that lasted. By the time Salvo Marchetti understood what was happening to him, he had nothing left to fight with. And the night Dimitri's men finally came for him, it was not in the dramatic, bloody confrontation the city half expected. It was quiet, and it was final. And Port Meridian never spoke of Salvo Marchetti again. Naomi never went back to work the fry station at Ombra, not because Dimitri asked her not to. He never asked her to give up anything, understanding by then exactly how much that would cost him with her, but because she found in the aftermath of everything that she didn't want to keep that part of herself folded away any longer. She began, quietly at first, training a handful of the men in Dimitri's organization in basic trauma response, the kind of thing that could mean the difference between a survivable wound and a funeral. And within a year, she had built something that had never existed on those docks before. Competence that didn't ask anyone's permission to exist, respected on its own terms, by a woman who no longer needed to hide behind a fry station to feel safe. Sergio, watching all of it unfold from the careful distance he'd always kept, would later say it was the only time in 9 years he'd seen Dimitri Kane build something instead of simply defending what he already had. The docks stayed the docks. The money still moved, the arrangements still held, but underneath it, something had shifted permanently, and the men who worked the waterfront noticed it long before they could have named it. A boss who had once been feared purely for his stillness was now feared for something else too. The knowledge that there was finally a line he would cross the entire city to protect. And that line had a name. Lily grew up in the strange, unconventional household that formed around her, with a mother who had finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she was, and a man who had learned, slower than he would ever admit, that the strongest thing he had ever done wasn't building an empire on the docks. It was letting a line cook see all the way through him on a cold sidewalk and choosing not to look away. Dimitri Kane still eats at the same corner table on his birthday every year. The reservation has never lapsed since, but the table is set for 3 now. And every year, before the meal is served, he takes out that same dented steel lighter that belonged to his father, turns it over once in his fingers, and thinks about how close he came to never knowing the woman sitting across from him, the one everyone else had spent 4 months looking straight through. If you were captivated by Naomi Reyes' hidden strength and Dimitri Kane's dark, guarded obsession, don't forget to hit that like button. We love bringing you these intense stories filled with betrayal, power, and unexpected twists. What would you have done in Naomi's shoes? Would you have run toward the danger or away from it? Drop a comment below and let us know. Make sure to subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss a story.